what Israel is afraid of is not to cross the borders with Lebanon. That is terrifying for the Israelis. What about we show even further weakness and we increase the appetite of Hezbollah crossing the borders? What about the other axis of the resistance saying, well, perhaps it's a time to direct a strong hit against the Israelis and their allies in the region? What's going to happen to the American bases in Iraq? Are they going to be soft on them? Is the Iraqi resistance going to be soft? I don't think so. What's going to happen to the presence of the American occupying the northeast of Syria? Is that going to get away with it depending on the intensity of the battle in Lebanon in case of war?
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. After 8 months of live stream genocide in Gaza, Israel has still yet to achieve its military objectives. It hasn't destroyed Hamas. It hasn't released all its hostages, aside from a handful that it returned through a horrific massacre of hundreds of Palestinians. And its leadership looks increasingly irrational and desperate as it seeks to escalate on all fronts, eyeing Lebanon next. But if the Israelis can't defeat the Qassam brigades who are operating under the harshest conditions from inside a besieged death camp, how do they think they can even begin to properly face the much larger and far more powerful Hezbollah without severe consequences? U.S. officials have tried to diplomatically avert an all-out war on Lebanon because even they recognize Israel can't win, and it would potentially draw in Iran and the U.S. But rationality isn't Israel's strong suit. Its sponsors have allowed it to go as far as it wants with zero red lines, meaning Israeli delusions of grandeur and messianic genocidal ambitions for territorial expansion rule the day. So, what would a big war between Israel and Hezbollah look like in the Levant and across the region? What are the latest military developments from Gaza to Lebanon? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by veteran war correspondent and analyst Elijah Magnier. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can always donate below on YouTube. Elijah, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you back on. And the last time I had you on was sometime in the beginning of the year. It was either January or February. We talked about military developments across the various fronts with regard to Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. We focused a bit on Lebanon. We talked about Iran. We talked about Yemen, Iraq. So I want to cover some of those same bases today with a bit of a more focus on what everybody seems to be most concerned about right now, which is a potential all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah. But before we get to that, I thought it would be good to maybe start with an update, if you will, on, what are your thoughts on the sort of military situation in Gaza, right? We're 8 months into this horrific live streamed slaughter that Israel's been carrying out. Israel went in saying that their intention, their goal was to eradicate Hamas. That has not happened. There are still ongoing battles. Israel has managed to kill tens of thousands of civilians in the process. They haven't gotten all their hostages back because they refused to abide by any sort of ceasefire that would do that. Can you kind of paint us a picture of the current situation, militarily speaking, in Gaza? Is Israel any closer to achieving its goals? Do you think this will end anytime soon? And how long do you think Hamas can last? I know that's a lot in there, but yeah, feel free to take that where you'd like.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Even if it looks like outside the topic, I would like to start with something extremely significant, which is what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres enlisted Israel with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Boko Haram as a terrorist entity. This is now we can comfortably say that Israel and terrorism are the same thing, according to the United Nations. That is a decision of the Secretary General, and this is why it is very significant. Having said that, the reason why Antonio Guterres did that is because the Israelis have failed to achieve any of the stated objective militarily. Nevertheless, they have managed to kill 16,500 children of Gaza, and they've killed around 38,000 as a total, of which 70% are civilians, children, women, elderly, and others. And this is the only thing they have achieved, the Israeli forces have achieved, apart from the destruction of the Gaza infrastructure and homes. So more than 500,000 of the Palestinian homes have been destroyed, hospitals, universities, schools, everything. From the military approach, that is far from being an achievement, because we have seen how the Israelis went to the north and then they said, we mission accomplished, we finished the job. They went to the south, they said exactly the same, and then went to Rafah. But then they started again in the north, and then they do some sort of on and off attacks in the south. We're talking about Beit Hanun, Hamad, and all that area. And then the operation in Rafah continued thanks to the permission given by Egypt, because the Israelis have deployed a full division in Rafah. They have deployed mechanic divisions. They have deployed jets and helicopters, and all that is violating 1978 peace agreement, that is Camp David Accord, and the 2005 additional protocol. And because of that, the Israelis are deployed on the Philadelphia corridor, the 14 kilometers along the Egyptian borders. They managed to kill 2 Egyptian soldiers, but Egypt closed both eyes on what the Israelis have done. But their biggest failure is inside Rafah, and in particular, the area that is less inhabited. And this is where the Israelis are receiving one hit after another. We have heard how the Israelis on daily basis are announcing between 8 to 11 officers and soldiers killed, and a total between 16 to 32 casualties per day in Rafah. That is significant because it shows how the organization of the Palestinian resistance is ongoing while the battle is happening. We have seen how the Palestinian resistance is still bombing the Gaza envelope from the north, where the Israelis were operating and then pulled out, from the south, and even from Rafah. They bombed the eastern side of the Gaza envelope settlements, and they have managed to cause really some damage to the Israelis, forcing them to go to shelters. So that is significant because the Palestinian resistance is always sending messages that we are still healthy, powerful, and we have not been defeated, with their actions, not with their words. And the Israelis are coming to a conclusion where they have to withdraw from Rafah in the next couple of weeks, which means the war is stagnating without achieving any purpose, and it's time to sit with Hamas, that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, promised to destroy, with the recommendation of the Americans to go and sit with Hamas, that even the Americans said they need to be finished off. So we are back to square one, of course, with many civilians killed, destruction of Gaza, but again, the Palestinian resistance has shown the fragility of the Israeli army that used to be known as the strongest, one of the strongest in the world, and the best equipped militarily.
Yeah, that's all very important to understand, especially in terms of what the Israelis are now saying. I mean, there's always so much bluster from Israeli officials, but across the political spectrum, you hear increasing rhetoric about, we need to destroy Lebanon. We need to turn our attention to what's happening in the north. Even Benny Gantz, who's supposed to be this liberal figure in Israel that the Biden administration, prefers to the Likud party and people like Benjamin Netanyahu. Even he recently said Lebanon must burn. And this is, of course, me and you are talking as we're speaking. Amos Hochstein, the envoy appointed by President Joe Biden, is visiting Lebanon right now, where I am, speaking to Lebanese officials after a visit to Israel, trying to essentially stave off an all-out war, because even the Americans don't think the Israelis would be able to achieve their military objectives in Lebanon, let alone, the fact that they haven't been able to do so in Gaza. Now, you recently wrote a piece, Elijah, at your website. It's called, "Is There Any Potential Israeli War on Lebanon? Scenarios and Implications." And this is such an important piece. And I want to go into some of the various topics you highlight. Now, I want to make it clear, though, the U.S. does seem to, in fact, not want a war, an all-out war with Lebanon. They're trying to prevent it. But we've also seen that the U.S. still lets Israel make its own decisions for the most part. So it's still unclear, what would actually happen if Israel would be reckless enough to do this. I do want to point out, before we get into your piece, there was a recent piece by Ali Hesham, the Al Jazeera English reporter, in foreign policy. And I just want to quote something he said that stood out to me. He said, "An official in Iran's Quds force overseeing Hezbollah and other Iranian-linked factions in the Middle East told Foreign Policy that Hezbollah now possesses more than 1 million rockets of various types, including precision-guided missiles and modified Katyusha rockets for increased accuracy, as well as anti-tank missiles." And that's, of course, in addition to all the suicide drones and other drones that are equipped with many different kinds of missiles that enable air-launched attacks from inside, from inside Israeli territory. A lot of Iranian missiles equipped with cameras. A lot of Israeli missiles that have been taken from Lebanon and recreated and made into working missiles for Hezbollah. You and I talked a bit about these kinds of things the last time I had you on, but Hezbollah's arsenal is massive. So I want to move to your piece now. You write, and I'm quoting you, "The primary Israeli military concern is that the enormous damage that Hezbollah could inflict on the domestic front, meaning the Israeli economy, industry, and the future fragile security of Israel." So let's start there. Let's say a war were to break out. I'm sure this is something that Israelis are playing out, Hezbollah is playing out, American officials are playing out. If an all-out war were to break out, what is this damage that you're referring to that Hezbollah has the potential to inflict on Israel?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So let's start with what the Israeli military spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, said. He said that Hezbollah has fired more than 5,000 rockets, missiles, and drones against Israeli barracks along the south of Lebanon borders. Normally, Israel doesn't need a reason to start a war, but Israel had 5,000 reasons to start a war with Lebanon, and it didn't. First of all, the merit goes to the Palestinian resistance, who exposed the fragility of the Israeli army, incapable within 364 square kilometers to defeat a resistance that is living in the open concentration camp, where modern weapons are extremely difficult to bring in, and they rely first on the soul of a fighter, second on the will to defeat the enemy, third on their attachment to their ancestors' land, and fourth on the weapon that they manufacture locally, even if these weapons are primitive, but they are quite efficient against an enemy when the fighter is really determined to confront another that doesn't own the land and is afraid of going and needs to destroy everything before going in. So that was a very big lesson for the axis of the resistance, including Hezbollah, that took the initiative for the first time in the history of Israel since 1948 to take the initiative and attack Israel and start the war on the 8th of October, and then increase in intensity, challenging, humiliating the Israelis, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, more than 55 times came to the border with Lebanon and threatened to destroy and annihilate Lebanon. Ben Gvir, the security minister, said he will burn Lebanon, and every now and then there are between 15 to 21 firefighter Israeli teams trying to control the fire that is in Israel along the borders due to the Hezbollah rockets and drones and missiles. So we have seen all empty rhetoric. And what you rightly said about Amos Hochstein, the US envoy, who came to Lebanon to try and save Israel. This is exactly what the Americans are trying to do, trying to spare Israel further humiliation in Gaza and major humiliation in Lebanon. So, what is the scenario, the worst case scenario that Israel can have by confronting Lebanon? Because the resistance is part of the country, part of Lebanon, and it is part of the ministerial communique that recognizes the right of the resistance, the people in the army, to defend the country. Now, first of all, the infantry. It is impossible for such an infantry that we have seen its performance in Gaza to go to a much more equipped, better experienced, and highly motivated special forces Hezbollah to be confronted with. On the south of Lebanon today, there is a very small number of Hezbollah who are operating today because Hezbollah doesn't need a large number, first, to reduce the casualties. Second, there is no need with what Hezbollah is launching between 100 to 300 rockets and artillery, because Hezbollah has the audacity to use even Howitzer 152 millimeter on the borders, exposing that to all the 70, 80 Israeli drones and fire artillery shells on the Israelis. Apart from what you rightly mentioned, the drones, the televised drone with television showing the word where it's a target, but not only that, drones acting as reconnaissance, filming how other drones are reaching their objective and attacking it. We've seen that only in the West, only with the Israelis and the Americans, and now we are seeing it in Hezbollah, that is showing to the Israelis their modern capability. Now, the infantry cannot go in. First, because Hezbollah has more powerful laser anti-tank missiles that Hezbollah has fired more than 1,500 so far, only of these laser guided, which is much more than what France's arsenal is of laser guided missiles, which means that Hezbollah has 10 times more and is still bringing in all the ammunition needed as long as Hezbollah is using it. Secondly, the tanks cannot go in because we've seen how the mechanic units have failed in confronting the RPG Yasin Palestinian manufactured RPGs, and how this is causing damage to the Israeli mechanic units. Thirdly, the Navy is out of the equation since 2006, when Hezbollah had primitive surface-to-surface missile, and we're talking about the Chinese C-802 missile that hit the Hanit SAR-5 and brought the entire Navy out of the equation. Today, Hezbollah has much more modern surface-to-surface missile. Now, the only way to confront Hezbollah is with the Air Force. And even that, we've seen Hezbollah downing 5 Hermes 450 and 900 and other 2 Skylark drones. And the Sayad 2C that the anti-air missile Hezbollah has used is faster than the F-16, but the F-16 has much more maneuver, but not on a low altitude. So it can bring down the Israeli jets. Also, What about all the Israeli oil and gas rigs? What about Haifa and Ashdod? What about the Mediterranean? Just crippling entirely the Israeli economy. What about all the barracks that are along the borders? But not only that, what the Israelis did, thinking they are clever and Hezbollah's capability is limited, they have improvised 800 meters to 1,000 meters away from the original barracks, a newly improvised position where they gather the forces to tell Hezbollah, okay, well, you have collected information about us. You know where is our location. We have a new one that you don't know. This is exactly what Hezbollah is targeting. It's targeting the newly improvised position. It's targeting the position of the Israeli intelligence unit in civilian residence that were improvised in many settlements along the borders. So it's showing the update information that Hezbollah has. And the last point, and I allow you to speak, is what about if Israel wants to bomb until south of the Litani River? So we're talking about at least 200,000 of internally displaced Israeli people that are going to move out because Hezbollah will target until Nahariya. What about north of the Litani River? Then Hezbollah will extend to Haifa. And we're talking about 1 million Israeli refugees. What about Beirut? And then we're talking about Tel Aviv. What about the Bekaa Valley, including Beirut? Then we're talking about beyond Tel Aviv. Then how many millions will go to the shelters? We've seen a couple of weeks ago Hezbollah targeting just close to Haifa, and we've seen between 200,000 and 1 million refugees in one day when everybody started in Israel screaming, either you get rid of Hezbollah and that is not available, or we stop this war because we can't afford it. Now, the Major General Ishaq Brick, the Israeli Major General, said that Netanyahu is exposing Israel to a Holocaust in case of a war with Lebanon that will lead to the collapse of Israel. Other people talking about we will wake up one day and we will have something similar to the explosion of an atomic bomb in the center of Israel, not because Hezbollah has an atomic bomb, but because it will bring hundreds of thousands of people in shelters and everything on the surface will be destroyed if Israel destroys and start targeting civilians and infrastructure in Lebanon. Because of that, and because of fragility of the Israeli army, no reservist, no extra battalion that the army needs, no appetite for the Americans to be engaged in a wider war, Israel is not going to go and wage a war on Lebanon.
And I want to also ask you about a particular group that the Israelis have been so focused on. I mean, they talk about it like it's the thing they fear the most in the war. This is in the world. This is the Redwan forces, which are, I believe, a few units within Hezbollah. You can actually explain that. Can you tell our audience who are the Redwan forces and what would their role be in an Israeli attack on Lebanon? That even if it doesn't happen, this is something that the Israelis play out when they have to think about whether they're going to do this or not.
First of all, Hezbollah created what is called the intervention force. And that was when Elijah Magnier was around, and he was determined to create a force that is extremely well trained, exposed to all kinds of weapons in all weathers, and would go to a specific special training that exceeds the training of the Seas or the Ranger even. The training is beyond 1.5 years. No one above the 35 years old is allowed to continue, and they would be moved to other units. And they have extended experience in the war in Syria, fighting on 80,000 square kilometers, when Lebanon, we're talking about only 6,000 square kilometers, the area that is not under the control of the Shia populated people. But if we're talking about the south of Lebanon, where Israel needs or may think about attacking, we're talking about between 4,000 to 5,000 square kilometers, including the Bekaa Valley. So we're talking about a minute area where the Rudwan forces that were called Rudwan because of Imad Mognier's is called Hajj Rudwan, and they would operate in 4,500 square kilometers when these Ridwan forces operated in 80,000 square kilometers in Syria and in much bigger surface in Iraq. In different circumstances, they fought in the desert, they fought in against Al-Qaeda and ISIS in urban warfare, in fought along the Russian and the Syrian army. They were everywhere and they experienced everything. And they go to a regular training on daily basis, on monthly basis, and on yearly basis, updated on the latest technology. These are the people that the Israelis are going to fight one day. I hope not for the Israelis. So what's going to happen is that these forces, the number of these forces has increased, that between 7,000 to 10,000, and they were deployed in the south of Lebanon before the war. When the war started, the number of the deployment of this force was extremely reduced to reduce the casualties, because there is no need for such a number on the borders, and because Hezbollah was adapting to artificial intelligence that Israel is using, recognizing the presence of the fighters. They follow them at home, they follow them in previous offices and places. They have managed through artificial intelligence draw a map before the war on the places they frequent. But the Israelis are not behaving with Hezbollah as they are behaving with the Palestinians. With the Palestinians, there is a big margin of error of artificial intelligence, and because the Israelis feel in a much more powerful position, they are taking on board all the objectives presented by the artificial intelligence, and this is why they are inflicting very heavy civilian casualties over the Palestinians. They don't dare to do the same in Lebanon, but then because they will be confronted with an equal attack on the civilians if Israel does the same. So the Israelis have to be extremely careful in selecting the target. The Ridwan force is today on the side, most of it, but only a small part of it, that is related to the anti-air missiles, to the anti-tank missiles and laser-guided missiles, to the artillery, and to the drones that they have experienced and mastered. And we've seen that in their videos, in attack and in maneuvering, visible or behind hills or behind concrete or hidden in different parts that the Israelis try to camouflage. And this is the unit that Israel is afraid of confronting. And this is the unit that is preventing the Israelis from thinking about going into Lebanon or occupying any main hills, because Hezbollah also think what Israel can be capable of doing and what is the worst case scenario. And they discover, according to what I come across with, that it is possible for the Israeli to come and occupy few hills, but then it is impossible for the Israeli to spend even the night there, because the function of the Rudwan special forces is to make sure that the Israeli will not be able to leave where do they put their foot in the south of Lebanon beyond the borders. So what we have today is we have a buffer zone for the first time that was created inside beyond the Lebanese borders, where no Israeli can live, and everybody has abandoned it. For the first time, Israel not only is attacked on the 8th of October, is forced to humiliation, and there is a buffer zone that is created in the land that is under its occupation, and it is not taking the initiative to transport the battle into what is called the enemy territory.
And, real quick, since you mentioned the buffer zone, which we've heard a lot about, I want to actually show a map that the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is like a horrible Zionist think tank in Washington, D.C. Though I will credit them, they did create this interactive map that I'm showing on the screen right now of essentially they catalog the Israeli strikes on southern Lebanon and the Hezbollah strikes on northern Israel. And it's a really, really interesting map to look at because what you see is, for those who are watching, all these little blue dots are the Israeli strikes since October 8th. Let me zoom in a little bit. This is the northern Israel border and the southern Lebanon border. And then all the yellow strikes are Hezbollah's strikes on northern Israel. So, I mean, it's not like there's the vast majority of them are not blue or yellow. It seems to be pretty even because what you've had since October 8th is this tit for tat. Obviously, Israel has, far more destructive weapons than Hezbollah has. That said, this is the buffer zone you're talking about. It's created this buffer zone inside northern Israel, as well as you could say southern Lebanon, right? People from both of these sides of the border have essentially been displaced in significant numbers because of the back and forth. But I'm curious, Elijah, could you just elaborate a bit on the significance of this buffer zone in terms of what it's meant for Israel? Because this is the first time in history since the creation of this state that there has been a buffer zone inside of territory Israel controls.
The most significant first point, I would say, is how Hezbollah is conducting a war along 120 kilometers equally, engaging the Israelis on a large front. And that is not easy from the military point of view. To be able to open a front that is so wide, including the Golan Heights, that is a Syrian territory occupied by the Israelis, where there are several very important and significant Israeli military facilities that can even monitor Turkey from that area and the whole of Syria. And for Hezbollah to send a message saying that we are hitting you in barracks that you have those who are static and others which are improvised along the 120 kilometers, that is unheard of. Not even a classical army can maintain such an intensity as your map is showing for almost 9 months. That is very significant. Secondly, the quantity of weapons and ammunition. When Hezbollah is using so much ammunition along 120 kilometers, ready for a war that can last at least 1 year with Israel, and decide that it's important to inflict serious damage on the domestic front and maintain between 500 to 1,500 rocket missiles per day, we're talking about an arsenal that is very, very large, with the possibility that maybe Israel will be able, with its air force, to close the supply line. Thirdly, it indicates and reinforces the point that Hezbollah is manufacturing weapons domestically, apart from modifying these weapons to fit its war. And that will help Hezbollah to sustain the battle. Fourth, what we are seeing today above the ground, I think it is very little in comparison of the cities under the ground. We're not talking about tunnels. We're talking about cities. And the importance of this city or cities in the south of Lebanon has a purpose. To fight against artificial intelligence, fighters need to go under the ground and not remain above the ground, because artificial intelligence is very developed and can monitor something that the naked eye cannot see. This is why it is important to make sure that there is no difference of the topography when fighters to go to one place and then to another, the change, the burning of the leaves due to the fire when a laser guided missile is fired, or artillery, or a rocket, because traces will always be left behind. This is why it is important to make sure that the fighters can live under the ground as they live above the ground, and even better. The communication also, it's important, because when fighters go to the south of Lebanon, sometimes for 10 to 15 days, they cannot be replaced. So they have to be able to sustain a long period of time fighting every day against an enemy without being replaced. Another point is the logistic supply. So they have to have enough ammunition and food and water to sustain their presence and continue the battle. So they are completely autonomous. This is not, a classical army cannot do that. A non-state actor cannot do that. And this is why Hezbollah is called a highly organized, irregular non-state actor, because it has managed to combine both the classical and the guerrilla warfare using modern technology, but everything that a special force need, which is completely different from a classical army, where special forces can live in all conditions, and they have the endurance to sustain a long life and a long resilience and fighting as long as it takes. So what we see on the map, we see something that, as you have shown the people who are watching this video, this is exactly what the Israelis are looking at in their operational room. And they are thinking how the hell we can attack an organized non-state actor that can spread everywhere. Because at certain point in the past, Hezbollah used to think, well, maybe the Israelis can come from the Syrian axis. That is the most fragile. And then the Syrian axis is not active yet, because this is where Hezbollah is ready for them on the Syrian soil. And this is something that President Bashar al-Assad fully gave his consensus in case Israel attacks. So for that, Syria is not going to be on the side, but it will be more engaged than Lebanon in case of an all-out war. But there's another point that is important as you are in Lebanon for the Lebanese to hear. Of course, Hezbollah doesn't need men, because it has tens of thousands of well-trained men to fight. Nevertheless, Hezbollah doesn't mind to have specialized units that come from the friend and the members of the axis of the resistance. These people can come to Lebanon and can support, because Hezbollah needs to sustain on daily basis, as I said, between 500 to 1,500. The figures of 4,000 to 5,000 are a bit...
You're talking about missiles.
Sorry?
You're talking about missiles? The number you're putting out? But you said
yes.
500 to 1,500. You're talking about like daily missile attacks.
Daily, yeah, daily.
In an all-out war, yeah, okay.
Yeah, rocket, missiles, and drones, and artillery.
Yeah. And when you mentioned 4,000, well, you're just real quick to specify for people who are listening and watching, when you say 4,000, 5,000, that's the estimate of daily attacks that the Israelis say Hezbollah is capable of firing. But please go ahead.
Yeah, it's not realistic, because if we divide that, if we multiply that by 365 days, we have over 1 million, and this is not something that is logical from the military point of view, because for Hezbollah, as Hezbollah did in 2006, we understood that it is extremely important to show to the Israelis a capability of launch on daily basis, non-stop, without any break. And that is something that puts a lot of pressure, not only on the military, psychologically, militarily, and on the domestic front, that they have to live for 365 days in their shelters all the time. And this is why 400 to 500 rockets and missiles, I think, are enough to keep all of Israel in the shelter for a year. Can they live that? but we're not talking about easy missiles. Because if the Israeli want to advance in the Lebanese territory, then this is something that is going to be detrimental for Israel. I will explain why. Because the further Hezbollah needs to fire its missiles, the heavier the missile is going to be. So we start talking about at least 400 kilograms of explosive, with missile carrying heavy explosive to hit the Israelis. And we're talking about between 400 or 350 to 2,100 kilograms of explosive. So the further the Israelis cross the border, the heavier they will have to endure on the domestic front and on the barracks. So this is not in their advantage. So I was saying that sustaining the 500 to 1,500 missiles, rocket, and drone per day is something that Hezbollah would easily do to show the Israelis the capability. But then who is going to fire that every day nonstop? This is where the allies come into action, specialized allies. But my question is, what's going to happen to these allies at the end of the war? Are they going to leave? I don't think so. Because in this case, they will remain in Lebanon and they will continue supporting the Hezbollah for a longer war. But then the further the Israelis want to push the Hezbollah and its society away from the south and the Bekaa Valley, these people need to go somewhere. They're not going to go to Syria. They're going to go inland, and they're going to go into the Lebanese territory. Are the US allies thinking about this possibility? What's going to happen to the allies of the US? Are the Israelis thinking about their potential allies in Lebanon? What's going to happen to them when this society needs to move from one area to another? So all these questions, I think the Israelis and the Americans need to think about very carefully, how they're going to change the geography of Lebanon. But the Shia are not going to go anywhere. They're going to stay in Lebanon, but they have to stay somewhere, and in particular in areas where a society is supportive of Israel, because there will not be a room for them.
So I also just want to point out, and this is something you mentioned in your piece, when we talk about the destructive capacity that Hezbollah has to inflict on Israel, it's not also, of course, to deny what they can do to Lebanon. We know they can destroy Lebanon. There's no question with their air superiority, but Hezbollah has also shown that it does have surface to air missiles that have been able to bring down Israeli drones, that could potentially be used against Israeli fighter jets. And then, you could lead to the capture of pilots. I mean, there's so many situations that are so damaging for the Israelis that could come out of a war on Lebanon, even if they were to destroy Lebanon. And a point you make, too, that I just want to emphasize is that Hezbollah has the capacity to endure, and Lebanon actually has the capacity to endure more than Israel can. Hezbollah can handle casualties in a way that Israel cannot. It can deal with the financial damage. It's already under extreme sanction. Lebanon's already in economic collapse. These are not things that the Israelis are used to, that then they would have to endure, like the economic consequences of a broader war would be quite devastating for Israel as well, something that Lebanon's already used to dealing with. So in many cases, the Israelis just aren't, and you mentioned also the attachment to the land. I mean, there's so many reasons why the Israelis are not prepared and will never be prepared for a big war with Hezbollah. But then there's also the addition of, and you kind of alluded to this when you're talking about allies, and this is something the Americans have repeatedly warned about when they're going to tell the Israelis, don't go to all-out war with Lebanon, don't go to all-out war with Lebanon, is the fear that it would draw in Iran. And so I'm just curious, because we haven't talked about that element. I wanted to just bring in the fact that just a couple months ago, the Iranians demonstrated their capability, at least some of their capability, when after Israel attacked their consulate in Damascus and killed several Iranian leaders, they responded with a very choreographed and, warned about missile launch. They launched 300 different kinds of missiles at the Israelis to demonstrate what they could do. The Israelis had a week of preparation, so several countries came in to help block any of these missiles from actually hitting Israel, which is, of course, is what Iran was betting on because they didn't want to provoke a bigger war. That said, are the Americans right? Do you think that if Israel did launch an all-out war on Lebanon, it would draw in the Iranians? And then ultimately what the Americans' big fear is that it would draw them in as well.
Well, it's really clever to mention the Iranian attack and if Iran is going to be involved or not, because
if you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.